In the summer of 1876, 40 men arrived at the Ashford plantation in Kentucky, looking for honest work in the tobacco and flower fields. None of them ever left. They were migrants, Irish, German, solitary, and no one came looking when they vanished, one by one, without sound or struggle. Their names faded from records. Their bodies were never found. Only the flowers remained, blooming in unnatural patterns, growing stronger with every disappearance. The landowners claimed the men had moved on, but their boots were found standing upright in the soil. Rosaries arranged in perfect spirals. And in the dead of night, whispers came from the fields, whispers calling new names. For decades, no one asked what truly fed the Ashford estate. No one questioned how the flowers grew so abundantly through drought and sickness, how the soil remained dark and rich even as neighboring farms withered. Until one man, Thomas Whitmore, arrived to oversee the harvest, and found himself counted among it. This is not just a Southern ghost story. It's a buried chapter of a forgotten region, where land and legacy demanded blood, and flowers never stopped blooming. Stay until the end. The final entry in the Ashford journals will show you exactly what it means to become the harvest. And if you listen closely, you might hear your name in the wind. Subscribe for more forgotten histories. Chapter 1. The Arrival of Men. The Kentucky heat hung like a shroud over Ashford Manor that July morning, thick and still as church air before confession. Thomas Whitmore adjusted his collar as he stepped down from the dusty carriage, his boots meeting the red clay that seemed to pulse beneath the sun's merciless gaze. He had come as the new overseer, hired by correspondents from a Silas Ashford whose letters bore the scent of roses and something else, something that made Thomas's stomach turn without reason. The manor stood before him like a monument to forgotten prosperity, its white columns stained yellow with age and neglect. Honeysuckle climbed the walls in wild profusion, choking the windows until they resembled dead eyes peering through green veils. Beyond the house stretched endless fields of tobacco and flowers, roses, lilies, and chrysanthemums in impossible abundance, their colors too vivid against the dying grass that bordered them. "Mr. Whitmore, I presume." The voice belonged to a woman who emerged from the shadows of the veranda like smoke taking human form. Margaret Ashford moved with the fluid grace of the wealthy and the damned, her black dress rustling against the floorboards. Her face bore the sharp beauty of her bloodline, but her eyes held depths that made Thomas think of well water in winter. "Mrs. Ashford." He removed his hat, noting how the flowers seemed to lean toward her as she passed, their petals following her movement like loyal pets. "Your husband's letter spoke of urgent need for organization before harvest." A smile played at her lips, never quite forming. "Silas is indisposed. The heat affects him poorly these days. But yes, the workers have been restless. 40 men from the rail camps, mostly Irish and German. Good workers when properly managed." She gestured toward the crude barracks visible beyond the flower fields, where thin lines of smoke rose from cooking fires. "They speak of leaving before the harvest is complete. Such foolishness would ruin us." Thomas followed her gaze to the distant figures moving among the crops. Even from this distance, something struck him as wrong about their posture, too rigid, too purposeful, like men walking in their sleep. "What do they fear?" "Superstition," Margaret said, but her fingers worried the lace at her throat. "The foreign-born are prone to wild fancies. They speak of voices in the night, of flowers that whisper. Such nonsense." She turned to face him fully, and Thomas caught a whiff of that same strange sweetness from her husband's letters, cloying and corrupt. "Your job is to keep them working until the harvest moon. Nothing more." The tour of the grounds revealed the true scope of Ashford wealth. The flower fields stretched for acres, perfectly ordered rows of blooms that seemed to thrive despite the withering heat. Thomas had managed plantations before, but never had he seen such unnatural abundance. The soil itself seemed to pulse with life, dark and rich as blood. "The greenhouse," Margaret said as they approached a structure of glass and iron that gleamed like a jewel in the afternoon sun, "is off limits to the workers. Family business only." Her tone brooked no argument, but Thomas caught her glancing at the locked doors with something that might have been fear. Inside the workers' quarters, Thomas found men who barely looked up at his approach. They huddled around their meager meals with the furtive intensity of animals expecting predators. When he introduced himself, their responses came in careful, measured words, too careful for simple laborers. "The flowers," one man whispered when Thomas pressed about their concerns. His accent marked him as German, but his eyes held the universal look of a man who had seen too much. "They sing at night. We hear them calling names of men who worked here before." "Where are these previous workers now?" Thomas asked. The German's face went pale. "We do not know. The Ashfords say they moved on to other work. But sometimes, in the morning, we find their belongings buried in the flower beds. Just buried. Like someone planted them there." That evening, as Thomas settled into his modest quarters in the overseer's cottage, he heard it, a sound like wind through wheat, but there was no wind. He stepped onto his porch and listened to the night. From the flower fields came a susurrus of whispers, soft and insistent, rising and falling like a tide of voices. He strained to make out words, but the sound seemed to slither away from comprehension, leaving only the uncomfortable certainty that something was calling to him. In the distance, the manor windows glowed with lamplight, and Thomas thought he saw figures moving behind the glass. Too many figures for a household that consisted only of Silas and Margaret Ashford and their ancient servants. As he watched, one of the shadows seemed to turn toward him, and though he could make out no features across the darkness, he felt the weight of its attention like cold fingers on his spine. The whispers continued until dawn, and when Thomas finally slept, he dreamed of roots growing through his chest and flowers blooming from his mouth, their petals the color of dried blood. He woke with dirt under his fingernails and the taste of earth on his tongue, though he could not remember leaving his bed. Chapter 2: The Voices Among the Flowers. The first disappearance occurred on the third night of Thomas's tenure, discovered only when the morning bell failed to rouse Heinrich Müller, the German who had spoken of singing flowers. His bunk remained undisturbed, covers pulled tight and personal effects arranged with military precision, as if he had simply evaporated from within his dreams. "Perhaps he grew homesick," Margaret suggested when Thomas reported the missing man. She stood in the manor's conservatory, tending to orchids that bloomed in shades of purple so deep they appeared black. "These men come and go like seasonal birds. It means nothing." But Thomas had found Heinrich's boots by the edge of the flower fields, standing upright and empty in the red clay, pointing toward the greenhouse as if their owner had simply stepped out of them and walked on. The sight had filled him with inexplicable dread. The remaining 39 workers grew more skittish as the days passed. They moved in tight groups, speaking in hushed tones that died when Thomas approached. At mealtimes, they left empty chairs around their tables. Too many empty chairs, Thomas noticed, as if they were setting places for men who were no longer there but not quite gone. "They're marking graves," whispered Patrick O'Sullivan, an Irishman whose hands shook constantly despite the heat. "Every night, more flowers bloom where none were planted. Perfect circles of white lilies, right where we saw our brothers last." Thomas investigated that evening, lantern in hand, picking his way through the cultivated rows. The flowers Patrick described were indeed there, pristine rings of lilies that glowed like bone in the lamplight. The soil within each circle was soft and black, recently disturbed, but when Thomas knelt to examine it more closely, his lantern flickered and died, plunging him into darkness so complete it seemed solid. In that suffocating blackness, he heard them clearly for the first time, the voices rising from beneath his feet. They spoke in a dozen languages, crying out in unison, "The harvest comes. The harvest comes. We are the seeds, we are the soil." The words seemed to pour from the earth itself, vibrating through his bones until his teeth ached. When his lantern suddenly blazed back to life, Thomas found himself surrounded by workers, not the living men he knew, but translucent figures that wavered like heat mirages. Their faces bore the peaceful expressions of sleepers, but their mouths moved in silent screams. As he watched in horror, they began to sink into the ground, their ghostly forms disappearing beneath the flower beds like stones dropping into still water. Thomas fled, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Behind him, the whispers rose to a triumphant chorus before fading into the indifferent night. The next morning brought 2 more empty bunks. The O'Sullivan brothers, Patrick and Sean, vanished without trace. Thomas found their rosaries hanging from a fence post, the beads arranged in perfect spirals that hurt to look at directly. When he asked Margaret about the previous night's phenomena, she merely smiled her half-smile and offered him tea that tasted of roses and copper. "The harvest is almost upon us," she said, settling into her chair with feline grace. "Soon all our troubles will be over. The earth is hungry, Mr. Whitmore. It has been hungry for a very long time." "Where is your husband?" Thomas demanded. "I've been here nearly a week and haven't seen hide nor hair of him." Margaret's cup rattled against its saucer. "Silas is preparing. The ceremony requires considerable concentration. He cannot be disturbed." She set down her tea with deliberate care. "Perhaps you should focus on your own duties. Keep the men working. That is all we ask." But keeping the men working proved impossible. Each dawn revealed more empty beds, more phantom flowers blooming in the night. The survivors huddled together like sheep sensing wolves, their eyes darting constantly to the greenhouse that dominated the landscape like a glass cathedral. They spoke of seeing lights moving within its opaque walls, and shapes that might have been human if humans could bend in such impossible ways. Thomas began his own investigation of the manor, exploring rooms that seemed to shift and multiply when he wasn't looking directly at them. In the library, he found leather-bound journals chronicling decades of Ashford harvests, each entry more disturbing than the last. The handwriting changed over the years, but the words remained hauntingly similar. The compact holds. The earth drinks deep. The flowers remember what feeds them. In one journal, dated 1842, he found a passage that made his blood run cold. 37 souls this season, their essence drawn down through root and stem. The Cherokee were right. This land hungers for human dreams. Father's bargain grows stronger with each feeding, but the price grows heavier too. Sometimes I hear Mother calling from the rose garden, though she has been dead these 10 years. The flowers have taken her voice and made it their own. As Thomas read, he became aware of a presence behind him. He turned to find a figure in the doorway, tall, gaunt, dressed in clothes that had once been fine but now hung like funeral shrouds. The man's face was sharp with aristocratic breeding, but his eyes were the color of turned earth. "Mr. Whitmore," the figure said in a voice like autumn leaves. "I am Silas Ashford. I believe we need to talk." Chapter 3: The Seed of Blood. Silas Ashford moved through his own home like a ghost reluctant to accept its death, his footsteps making no sound on the Persian carpets that showed their age in threadbare patches. He led Thomas to a study whose windows faced away from the flower fields, as if even he could not bear to look upon his cursed inheritance in daylight. "You've been reading our family history," Silas observed, settling into a chair that seemed to swallow his frail form. "An admirable thoroughness, though I wonder if you truly comprehend what you've discovered." Thomas remained standing, every instinct screaming that he should flee this place, but morbid fascination held him fast. "The workers who've disappeared, they're not gone, are they? They're still here in the fields." A smile cracked Silas's lips like winter breaking. Gone implies they had somewhere else to go. The truth is far more collaborative. They remain with us always, part of our eternal harvest. He gestured to a portrait above the mantelpiece, a woman in colonial dress whose painted eyes seemed to follow movement. "My great-great-grandmother, Constance Ashford. She made the first bargain in 1798, when the land was barren and our family faced ruin." The painted woman's smile was identical to Margaret's, beautiful and terrible and knowing. "What manner of bargain?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. Silas rose and moved to a cabinet filled with strange instruments, gnarled roots in glass cases, pressed flowers arranged in occult patterns, soil samples labeled with dates stretching back decades. The Cherokee who lived here before us knew this land's true nature. They called it Nightgohidelf, the place where earth dreams. They made offerings to keep it sleeping, but when they were driven out. He shrugged eloquently. Constance was desperate. The tobacco wouldn't grow, the children were dying of fever. When the Cherokee shaman came to her in dreams, offering salvation, she listened. "A shaman? But surely that's..." Impossible? Look around us, Mr. Whitmore. Does anything here respect the boundaries of possibility? Silas lifted a photograph from his desk, a daguerreotype showing dozens of workers lined up before the manor. All their faces bore the same peaceful, vacant expression Thomas had seen on the ghostly figures in the fields. The bargain was simple. Feed the land human dreams, human hopes, human lives, and it would provide abundance beyond measure. Each generation of Ashfords has maintained the compact. Thomas studied the photograph more closely and felt his stomach lurch. In the background, barely visible among the flower rows, pale shapes moved like underwater creatures. How many? Over the years? Hundreds. Thousands, perhaps. The earth's hunger grows with each feeding. Silas's voice carried the weight of inherited guilt. We tell ourselves they volunteer, in a sense. The land calls to those who are already lost. Drifters, immigrants, men with no families to miss them. They come here seeking work and find purpose. This is madness, Thomas whispered, but even as he spoke, he remembered the strange pull he'd felt upon arriving, the way the flowers seemed to whisper his name. Is it? Silas opened another journal, this one bound in leather that looked disturbingly like human skin. Read this entry, from my grandfather's time. 1834. Thomas read aloud, his voice growing hoarse. The compact demands blood, but offers more than gold. Today I walked among the fields and spoke with Father, dead these 5 years but living still in root and stem. The flowers have made him eternal, transformed his essence into something pure and growing. Is this not preferable to the cold earth of ordinary graves? You see? Death is merely transformation here. The workers don't die, they become part of something greater, something that will bloom forever. Silas moved to the window despite his earlier reluctance, gazing out at the greenhouse that gleamed like a monstrous jewel. And tomorrow night, when the harvest moon rises full, 37 more souls will join their eternal garden. 37? But there are only 36 men left. Silas turned back to Thomas with eyes that held depths like rich soil. 36 workers, yes. But the compact requires 37 for this harvest. It has always required 37. His smile was patient and terrible. Why do you think we needed an overseer, Mr. Whitmore? Margaret's letters were quite specific about the type of man we required. Solitary, unattached, with no one to notice his absence. The truth struck Thomas like a physical blow. He had been chosen not for his skills, but for his isolation. His hands shook as he backed toward the door, but Silas made no move to stop him. You cannot leave, Silas said gently. The land has tasted your dreams already. Haven't you felt it? The way the flowers lean toward you, the way the earth seems to pulse beneath your feet? You belong here now, as surely as if you'd been born from our soil. Thomas fled the study, racing through corridors that seemed to stretch and twist around him. Behind him, Silas's laughter followed like the rustle of dead leaves. But even as Thomas ran, he felt the truth of the old man's words settling into his bones. Each night since his arrival, his dreams had grown more vivid, more rooted in earth and growing things. Each morning, he woke with dirt under his nails and the taste of flowers on his tongue. In the workers' quarters, he found only 12 men remaining, huddled around a single lamp like survivors of some unthinkable shipwreck. Their eyes held the glassy peace of the utterly doomed. You know, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. The youngest of them, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, nodded slowly. We've known for days. The dreams tell us everything. Tomorrow night, we go into the greenhouse. Tomorrow night, we become the garden. We have to fight this, Thomas urged. We have to try to escape. But the boy's smile was already Margaret's smile, beautiful and damned. Where would we go? The land has roots in us now. We are the harvest, Mr. Whitmore. We are the seed and the soil and the endless blooming. Why would we want to be anything else? Outside, the moon was waxing toward full, and the flowers sang lullabies that promised dreams of eternal spring. Chapter 4, The Last Day of Harvest. The harvest moon rose like a bloated eye over Ashford Manor, casting silver light that made the flower fields glow with unnatural luminescence. Thomas had spent the day in futile preparation, sharpening tools that would not cut the bonds holding him, writing letters that would never be sent, praying to a God who seemed absent from this cursed ground. The remaining workers had ceased all pretense of mortality. They moved through their final day like sleepwalkers, tending the fields with loving care, speaking to the flowers in whispers that the blooms seemed to understand. Some had begun to change already, their skin taking on the waxy translucence of petals, their eyes reflecting green depths like still ponds. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Margaret appeared beside Thomas as he stood on his cottage porch, watching the transformation unfold. She wore a gown of white silk that seemed to shift and flow like living water, and flowers had been woven into her hair, roses and lilies that bloomed fresh despite having no roots. To witness the miracle of true harvest. "How long has your family been mad?" Thomas asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Margaret's laugh was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Mad? Is the oak mad for growing tall? Is the rose mad for blooming? We are what we were always meant to be, gardeners of human souls, cultivators of eternal spring." She gestured toward the greenhouse, whose glass walls now pulsed with soft light from within. "Tonight you'll understand. Tonight, you'll join the garden and know the peace that passes all understanding." "And if I refuse?" "Oh, my dear Thomas." Her hand touched his cheek with surprising warmth. "You cannot refuse any more than a seed can refuse to sprout. The land has claimed you already. Look." Thomas looked down at his hands and gasped. Thin green lines traced his veins like delicate tattoos, and when he pressed his palms together, he felt the pulse of sap instead of blood. The change had been so gradual he hadn't noticed it happening, or perhaps some part of him had welcomed it. As darkness deepened, the workers began to gather before the greenhouse. They moved with ritual purpose, their faces serene as stone saints. Silas emerged from the manor, no longer the frail man Thomas had met, but transformed into something ancient and vital. His clothes had become bark and moss, his fingers had elongated into root-like appendages, and when he smiled, flowers bloomed between his teeth. "My children," he called, and his voice was the whisper of wind through wheat fields. "Tonight we fulfill the compact our ancestors made. Tonight we feed the hungry earth and ensure another season of abundance." The greenhouse doors swung open without human touch, revealing an interior that defied physical law. The space within seemed vast as a cathedral, filled with towering plants that moved without wind. At the center grew something that might once have been a tree but had become something far more complex. A living mandala of interwoven branches, roots, and flowering vines that pulsed with its own heartbeat. "The heart of the garden," Margaret whispered reverently. "Every soul we've given it has made it stronger, more beautiful. Soon it will bloom across all the earth, transforming everything into paradise." The workers filed into the greenhouse like communicants approaching an altar. Thomas found himself walking with them, his feet moving of their own accord. The green lines in his skin were spreading, and he could feel roots beginning to sprout from his toes, seeking purchase in the earth below. Inside the greenhouse, the air was thick with pollen and the sweet scent of decay. The workers arranged themselves in a circle around the heart, their faces turned upward toward its writhing canopy. One by one, they began to sink into the soil, not drowning but dissolving, their forms becoming translucent as they were absorbed into the greater organism. Thomas felt his own feet taking root, felt the strange joy of becoming part of something larger than himself. His consciousness began to expand, touching the minds of all who had gone before, hundreds of souls woven together in an endless tapestry of growing things. He could hear their voices, not lamenting their fate but celebrating it, singing hymns of photosynthesis and cellular division. But as his human awareness began to fade, a final spark of rebellion flared in his mind. With tremendous effort, he tore one hand free of the roots that were claiming him and pressed it against the greenhouse wall. The glass was cold, real, finite, a reminder of the world beyond this verdant hell. "No," he whispered, and the word echoed strangely in the vast space. "This is not salvation. This is not paradise. This is hunger wearing the mask of love." The heart shuddered at his rejection, its branches writhing in agitation. For a moment, the illusion wavered, and Thomas saw the greenhouse for what it truly was. A charnel house filled with the desiccated remains of countless victims, their bones forming the structure of the obscene tree thing at its center. But the vision lasted only seconds before the dream reasserted itself. Thomas felt his rebellion crumble as roots pierced his skull, filling his mind with visions of eternal spring. He sank into the earth with a sigh of surrender, his last human thought a prayer for the poor soul who would answer Margaret's letters next season. As dawn broke over Ashford Manor, the flower fields bloomed with unprecedented abundance. Roses the size of dinner plates, lilies that gleamed like bone, chrysanthemums in impossible colors that had no names. The greenhouse stood empty now, its doors open to the morning breeze, but in the fields, new flowers grew in perfect circles. 37 circles this year, each marking a life transformed into endless beauty. Margaret walked among them with quiet satisfaction, already composing the letters that would bring next year's workers. The compact would endure, as it always had, feeding the hungry earth with dreams and hopes and human souls. And in the flower beds, if one listened carefully, one could hear the voices of the gardens singing their eternal harvest song, promising that death was only the beginning of a far more beautiful existence. The Cherokee name for the place had been Nightgohidelf, the place where earth dreams. But the Ashfords had taught it to dream of different things, and now it would never wake again. In 1877, the Ashford plantation was abandoned after the family disappeared during a late-season fire that consumed only the manor house, leaving the flower fields mysteriously untouched. Local records show that 41 people vanished that summer: the Ashfords, their overseer, and 38 migrant workers whose names were never recorded. The land was eventually sold to the state and declared unsuitable for agriculture, though wildflowers continue to bloom there in patterns that satellite photography reveals to be almost perfectly circular. Visitors report hearing whispers on windless days, and several hikers have gone missing over the years, though their disappearances are typically attributed to the rough terrain and sudden weather changes common to the region. The greenhouse foundation remains visible among the ruins, and local folklore warns against approaching it during the harvest moon, when the flowers are said to glow with their own light and call out the names of those who hear them.